Good day, everyone, and thank you for being online with us today. This is the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, and this is the 𝗟𝗯𝗪𝗂𝗏 Institute for Research and Debate. This week, Cipriani College is having what is designated its Labor Week 2023. And we have been having a series of seminars in keeping with our theme this week, commemorating the legacy of labor. So today, we are going to be discussing the topic, strengthening collective bargaining. And I do have with me on the panel today some very distinguished guests, and I will introduce them to you shortly. But I just wanted to give you a few tips before we actually get into the presentations of each of our guests and also the actual discussion and question time. So first of all, just to indicate to you, you will be free to ask the panelists any questions. We just ask you to indicate ideally who you will be asking the question of. And in order to ask this question, it wouldn't be live. What we are asking you to do is to put your question in the chat. We're just requesting if you can be as concise and clear as possible so that the questions can be conveyed to the respective panelists, and that you just follow this and we will attempt to answer as many questions in the time that we have for you today. We also invite you to like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So, as I indicated today, we are dealing with the topic collective bargaining. And I think we all know that collective bargaining is a key function of every trade union, as they negotiate with employers, where they seek to get improved terms and conditions of employment. And everyone tends to, when we hear collective bargaining, the average person will focus, very easily gravitate, of course, to improved or increased salaries and wages. But collective bargaining in today's labor world is really becoming much more complex than that. It's not just a matter of wages and salaries anymore. We are looking at the whole question of improved terms and conditions of work, looking at the whole issue of remote work, lifestyle. There are issues focused on women and youth especially, etc. So there are quite a number of issues that we have to face as we are in the world of work today. And therefore, we are looking forward to a very interesting session as our very experienced panelists with a wide breadth of knowledge share some very focused perspectives with us on the topic today. So just permit me to introduce our panelists today. I will introduce our first panelist, and he is Dr. Grayson Koyi. Dr. Koyi is an economist and a labor researcher with over 25 years of professional experience in research, policy analysis, project management, and monitoring and evaluation. He is a results-oriented, analytical, and creative thinker and team player, and also is a multitasker. He's currently serving as Senior Specialist of Workers' Activities in the Bureau for Workers' Activities, 𝗟𝗯𝗪𝗂𝗏𝗪, at the ILO headquarters in Geneva. His work within 𝗟𝗯𝗪 advances the role and interest of workers and workers' organizations in relation to ILO development on cooperation, partnerships, program, and budget. This also spans to UN reforms and Agenda 2030, and also skills development and lifelong learning. So we are very happy today to have online this very distinguished our first presenter, Dr. Grayson Koyi. And Dr. Koyi, I would now invite you to present. If you have a presentation, we'd like to share some opening perspectives before we get into this the discussion area. Dr. Koyi.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you so much for your kind introduction and bio, which places a demand for me to be able to live up to the bio that you've presented. Uh, Thank you for the invitation. I should like to start by appreciating the opportunity that has been accorded to us from ILO ACTRAV to participate in this panel discussion. I will briefly address myself to the topic that was indicated, the question that was sent to us earlier on, but of course be able to relate also in that discussion to the subject of collective bargaining. But by and large, I will start by highlighting the work that is being done by ILO on sustainable development goals with trade unions and how this is being included in trade union work plans and work processes. I will also reflect on how this can potentially be integrated into collective agreements or into collective bargaining processes. And after that, I will be able to then be happy to interact through questions and suggestions. But I must start knowing that I only have up to about 7 minutes. I want to start by making two broader sessions that inform the initial statement that I make. And the first assertion is that the work that ILO does, and that is the ILO Bureau for Workers' Activities on SDGs with trade unions, is informed by the conviction that achieving Agenda 2030 is humanity's best chance for ensuring the progressive realization of workers' rights and a future of peace and prosperity for all. The second assertion that I make is that the implementation of sustainable development goals demands greater institutional capacity of workers' organizations, especially in relation to mainstreaming the ILO agenda on decent work into national priorities. And so our work as ACTRAV or ILO ACTRAV has largely been about communicating the messages and spreading an awareness and as to the significance of the SDGs, as to the significance and the consistency of the SDG, particularly SDG 8, with the work that the trade unions do around collective bargaining, and that indeed they can be reinforcing each other, and that the engagement of the trade union in SDG processes, as a matter of fact, does serve to further the purposeful interests of trade unions. But we also do realize that trade unions may be at different levels of capacity in terms of institutional capacity to appreciate and engage effectively in policy processes and dialogue processes that relate to the SDGs. And so we've been working around building the capacity, institutional capacity of the trade unions, in addition to the sensitization and the awareness to be able to ensure that the trade unions are at the same level of appreciation and wavelength insofar as the Agenda 2030 is concerned, and how that relates to the purposeful interest for which trade unions exist, including collective bargaining and protecting and pursuing the interests and protecting the interests of the workers. But in so doing, we also do realize that for trade unions to be heard and to be taken seriously when they come to the table of policy making, they need to be able to generate a portfolio of evidence around the issues that they articulate. and to be able to justify their space and why they are unique in terms of the mandates that they have to bring to the Agenda 2030. And for instance, in terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, and why they need not be left behind. And we're also aware that they need to be proactive to claim the spaces that are opening up in terms of policy dialogue, and that they also need to act on the present possibilities, therefore to be able to generate interest and to be able to ensure that they able to mobilize within their structures, and that there's support for the work that they do, and that there is a general acknowledgement and appreciation that they can be part of this and that they can on the agenda. But we also do realize in the work that we do that there's need for trade unions to be pragmatic and to be able to make certain trade-offs. And I think the trade unions are not a stranger to trade-offs, because the collective bargaining is about give and take. And so that same is true when it comes to the policy making processes. But they need to build a portfolio of evidence to be able to justify why certain suggestions that are coming from them have to be accepted, and not those coming from elsewhere. But we also do realize that there are instances where trade unions may not be speaking with one voice, and that it is significant, therefore, for them to be able to project a unified front when it comes to issues that relate to the SDGs, as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. So within that context, and much more specifically, we have been working around capacity development or enhancement for trade unions to participate effectively in policy dialogue mechanisms that relate to SDGs. For instance, when it comes to Agenda 2030, we've been working to build the capacity of trade unions to engage in the UN cooperation frameworks, which is a principal instrument through which the United Nations community does ensure that they support country development processes towards the realization of Agenda 2030. So we've been trying to build a capacity of trade unions around that. But we do also realize that the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework and the SDGs may not necessarily be welcome in terms of including everybody. Even within the UN family, there may be some agencies that may not be up to speed in terms of incorporating the trade union within that development policy processes. And so we've also been reaching out and advising other UN agencies as a way of trying to support the engagement of the trade unions. But we've also been supporting trade unions to also build networks, because the Agenda 2030 is also about partnerships. And so we've been supporting the trade unions to try and build networks. And one of the significance of this network is to be able to realize that they can broaden the social capital, and they can reinforce their positions around some issues that find common resonance with other interest groups in society. But we've also been developing knowledge products and documenting good practices that are emerging in terms of how the trade unions are engaging in the processes. We've also been delivering through the Turing Center some training programs that are targeted at building the capacity of the trade unions in terms of sustainable development cooperation frameworks, as well as the SDGs in general. The emerging from the assessments that we have, we are seeing some emerging good practices that suggest that the trade unions are taking the messages and the products that we are putting across into their day-to-day programming. For instance, when it comes to knowledge products, we have evidence that suggests that trade unions are using, for instance, the reference manual that we have developed around Agenda 2030, decent work, and the role of trade unions, and that they're using it in workers' education and training programs. We've also emerging evidence that trade unions are beginning to develop common position papers that are helping them to project a much more evidence-based submission into the development processes in the context of the SDGs. Let me come, as I conclude, as my time should be winding up, just reflect on how the work that we do with trade unions relate to collective bargaining agreements. And a useful starting point, perhaps I can indicate here, is that the trade unions would have to work around ensuring that relevant SDG targets related, for instance, to freedom of association and collective bargaining are part of the social dialogue and collective bargaining processes. So that framework that exists already within the SDG agenda, for instance, SDG 8.8, SDG 16.3, SDG 16.6, inform and are indeed at the center of the collective bargaining processes, and that they are not at the margin of it. And critical to ensuring that agenda processes become a part of the work that the trade unions do is to realize that Agenda 2030, and particularly the decent work agenda, is also about bread and butter issues, even though they might appear to be questions that are distant from the collective bargaining processes and agreements that are undertaken by the trade union. I should like to submit and thank you, and happy to engage further. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koyi, for being able to pack so much information in the time that was allotted. Quite a lot to digest. And I'd just like to remind our listeners and viewers that please remember you can take note of your questions and put them in the chat at the appropriate time, because we are going to go straight to our next guest and presenter. That's my good friend and colleague, Sister Sandra Massiah. And Sister Sandra is from the is the sub-regional secretary for the Caribbean Public Services International, PSI. Uh, she works with public service sector unions in the Caribbean sub-region to help build their capacity, visibility, and influence with a particular focus on workers and women. She has special interests in building regional solidarity. Some of her interests include climate change, migration, and development, and wider sustainable development issues. Sister Sandra certainly has a wide breadth of experience. We have known her within the trade union movement, within the social movement in the Caribbean region for quite a long time. And it is certainly my pleasure to introduce our sister, Sandra Massiah, to present to you now. Sister Sandra.
Great. Thank you, Trevor. And hello, my fellow panelists and listeners and viewers. Indeed, a pleasure to be with you. And I chuckled when Trevor mentioned the many years involvement in trade union and social social organizations, because I'm now at the stage where I kind of quiver when I hear about the many years and the long time that I've been involved in things. But to get straight to the point, collective bargaining and strengthening it. Certainly from the perspective of Public Services International, and indeed many of our partners in the global trade union movement, we are certainly positing that a number of the development needs and goals, especially in the Caribbean, and that's because of our history as well, really cannot be achieved without quality public services. We certainly are not going to go and run to the private sector to help solve the problems which they, in fact, have caused. That's the first thing. Secondly, and I was really glad that Grayson referred to it, the whole thinking about what is collective bargaining. And I refer to some of my experiences with not only those in the leadership of unions, but members in unions who seem to think that collective bargaining is at a particular point in time. Collective bargaining is ongoing. We do it every day on all sorts of issues. And while there may have been an emphasis, or let's say that the media picks up a lot on the wages and salaries part, for years, unions have been bargaining on conditions of service, have been bargaining on issues related to the development of their countries. We may not have couched it in those terms, but certainly that's what it has all boiled down to. I think what is happening is that we're becoming more and more aware that this is critical in this area, one. And two, while we're talking about collective bargaining, we also have to be very cognizant of, the different unions and their different needs. And really and truly, for those organizations where there are national centers, either one or multiple, we're going to have to find a way to get together on the things on which we agree, so that when we sit down across the table from the employers and from the policymakers, our voices are united. And in fact, in PSI, we've been doing a lot of the work in terms of building up the portfolio of evidence. And we've started doing that, I think, more so in the Caribbean as well. We have a paucity of evidence for some of the assertions that we made in terms of in writing, but there is no paucity in terms of the experiences of our members and potential members. And this is where I think, in terms of strengthening our work in terms of collective bargaining, this is one area that we need to be working on. How do we document all of these pieces of evidence so that we have that really good portfolio that when we sit down, we can cite all of these pieces of evidence? So that's the second thing I want to focus on. First, that collective bargaining is ongoing and that we have to be engaging in it in a more detailed and constructive way. Secondly, that we have to have not only a verbal or anecdotal portfolio of evidence, but something that's actually documented. And thirdly, and it's not the last point, but it's a very important one, who are we mentoring in terms of the ones who are going to carry out the collective bargaining exercises from now on into the next few years? Who are we mentoring and what are we mentoring them about? Are they fully aware, or are we making the effort to educate them about the various linkages and intersectionalities when it comes to collective bargaining? For example, do people really get the fact that we're really after a feminist agenda when we talk about collective bargaining and all the issues that we put on the bargaining agenda? Are we engaging our various shop stewards, liaison officers, whatever the term that we use in our respective countries may be? Are we engaging with them about the issues? Climate change is an issue, but not climate change only in terms of how it affects workers, but the fact that workers are part of the solution in terms of dealing with this climate crisis. And that when we talk about resilience, that we have to tell them, stop talking about resilience, let's talk about transformation. Let's talk about transformation of our economies. Let's talk about a different way of doing things. Are we educating our young members and potential members so that they become equipped to effectively deal with the collective bargaining process that has to start now and go on into the future? And my final point in this first round, when we talk about collective bargaining, are we still going to go along? And I'm dealing particularly with public sector unions. There's this thing about, we have this big agreement, and then there are these multiple clauses with maybe 2 or 3 articles dealing with, let's say, education or training and retraining. Shouldn't we also be thinking about collective agreements that deal with education, training, and retraining alone? Yes, we mentioned them in our omnibus agreements, but shouldn't we be delving into things like digital transformation and making sure that there is a collective agreement, and particularly for public sector workers, I say, because they're already in the door when it comes to setting public policy. Shouldn't we be looking at what it is we're bargaining for? Is there a need for different types of agreements? Is it that, particularly given the experiences of COVID, that we need to be having collective agreements that speak to the whole matter of remote work, telework, what have you, so that we're not having each union actually trying to get one or two clauses in, but that we have what can be seen as a national agreement that then covers workers no matter what sector they're in. So those are a few points that I'd like to put on the table for some thought and discussion about what we're talking about when we're dealing with strengthening collective bargaining. The what, the who, the when, and the why. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Sandra, and you certainly have not disappointed us. We didn't expect you to, because you always seem to challenge us, having to be very critical in our analysis and strategic thinking, and certainly the questions will certainly trigger some more in this discussion. So thank you so very much. And I would go straight to our third guest, a very special guest and colleague of mine, Comrade 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗰𝗆. Comrade 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗆 is currently the Chief Education and Research Officer and an Executive Trustee of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. He is also the General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement, and also General Secretary of the Movement for Social Justice. He's an elected member of the Financial Control Committee and Presidential Council of the World Federation of Trade Unions, and Secretary of the Industrial Global Union Caribbean region. He is currently chair of the local organizing committee for the Assembly of Caribbean People. 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗆, this is a short bio, Comrade 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗆, but I really don't know where you get the time to do all of this, but we do know that you do manage all of it effectively. So let me just allow you to do your presentation. And of course, I know you do have some limited time. I remind the listeners, so I know you do have to get to a very important meeting, but we would certainly like to have the benefit of hearing your presentation, and perhaps you going first with a few questions that we will feed to you right after your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Comrade Johnson. And of course, it's always great to be on a panel with my good friend and comrade, Sandra Massiah. And thanks, Comrade Grayson from the ILO. Excellent presentations. I don't think, Sandra, I could have said it better than you. I always learn from you, and I like how you always challenge us, right? So I'm going to take this particular angle. I want to talk about collective bargaining in a sort of fundamental way by looking at class struggle. In other words, I want us to understand collective bargaining as class struggle towards class emancipation. Marx observed in 1865 that wage levels can only be settled by the continuous struggle between capital and labor, and that the capitalists will constantly try to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the workers have to constantly press in the opposite direction. And I think, Sandra, you really said it fantastic when you said that, listen, collective bargaining is an ongoing process. It's not finite. And I think in describing it that way, you are better able to appreciate the class struggle involved in collective bargaining. Now, there are those who believe that the theory of collective social class action is inconsistent with individual rationality. But You know, and the thing is that has been the main line of argument in support of the continuous attack on collective agreements. What in fact the evidence show is the opposite, okay? Because in their view, they believe that the realization of collective choice somehow brings about some kind of unfortunate, unintended consequences. And they'll give you a whole list if you're ever in a discussion with them as to what are these unfortunate consequences. So they advance this idea that the more self-regulation, privately owned, free market economy, that can somehow solve many of the problems, providing individuals with better opportunities to reach their goals. But there is an alternative belief that whilst the person is a rational human being who endeavors to realize his or her preference, these preferences do not have to be individualistic in nature. And there's so much research that have been done on that shows that those preferences need not be individualistic in nature. And I want to challenge any bourgeois political scientist to deny the findings of their own empirical research that shows that. Now, collective agreements are the result of the class struggle and contains within it the value of labor power as determined by the resolution of such a conflict in very specific contexts. So, you know, since the 19th century, bourgeois academics have advanced the familiar argument that the rise of wages would lead to general rise in prices and the increase would bring no benefit to society. I'm trying to make that point to say that is not a new argument. They've been arguing that point since the 19th century. They've been trying to argue that point. And that's because they then did not understand what wages were. Even up to today, we just conjure in our minds strictly the money form of wages, right? But they didn't understand how the worker was exploited through the extraction of the surplus value, and therefore they confused the value of labor power with the value of the commodity produced. But if we understand how surplus value is created and because of the existence of surplus value, if you understand that, then an increase in wage, a general rise in the rate of wages, then will not affect the prices of commodities, but it results in a fall in the rate of profit. And that is their concern, their real concern. Unions and collective agreements that they negotiate are not only the workers' front line of defense against their employers under capitalism, but they are also, the collective agreements are also vehicles for struggle for the future self-emancipation of the working class. But there is also a contradiction whereby as unions, we negotiate the terms of exploitation of workers under capitalism. We also provide the same vehicle for struggle that can prepare the working class for revolution. But the divide and conquer strategy of the ruling class continues to play a real pivotal role. So capitalism forces workers basically into competition with each other, right? Even within the same workplace. So we have like one bargaining unit versus another bargaining unit. And the employers will exploit every opportunity to keep workers divided. And a good example was when the government, as part of its propaganda to support the closure of Petrotrin, they pit low-income workers against workers with collective agreements. However, organizing workers into unions does present the opportunity for collective struggle against employers and therefore reduces competition between workers. Unions are also essential to working class formation because, you see, under capitalism, the system of this free labor, where the individual workers sell their labor power to an employer for a wage, what that does, it fragments the social relations between the workers and makes them compete, as I said. And I think the Communist Manifesto described it perfectly when it said that the bourgeoisie has left no other nexus between man and man, it could be man and woman, woman and woman, man and man, than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment, leaving workers exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Now, indeed, while workers organize themselves and based on other collective identities, race, ethnicity, religion, etc., it is only a collective agreement that could unite them as workers against the source of their exploitation, which is the bourgeoisie. Now, in the period since the 2000, there have been several economic and political developments during this very crucial period, neoliberal period, that have had serious impact on collective bargaining. And of course, one of these is the aggressive pursuit of a neoliberal policy agenda in which trade unions and collective bargaining are viewed as fixed within the labor market at a time when they are seeking flexibility. And they believe that that flexibility will somehow create sustainable economic growth. But the empirical evidence have shown that that is not the case and have not been the case over the last 2 decades. Collective bargaining then has to be seen, or rather, collective bargaining is seen from their point of view as a bad word in terms of the dominant bourgeois political and economic discourse. The domination of neoliberal market-based policies, this kind of unrestricted opportunities for capital to pursue profit by any means necessary in an ever-increasing open market, and with low levels of trade union density and industrial action. These are what are the key features of our modern economies. In other words, it is really about, for them, it is about the liberalization of industrial relations, which is interestingly being facilitated by the state, which is one of the reasons social dialogue becomes difficult. So over the past decade, the trade union movement has been attacked by employers, governments, and their bourgeois allies. The economists, political scientists, commentators, and more recently in Trinidad and Tobago, you have a regular Sunday column under the false title of industrial relations. They all have one goal, and that is to weaken collective bargaining, thereby weakening the union movement. In particular, in our case, the state. That is the largest employer. So they are trying to eradicate collective bargaining, and they use all different types of strategies, contracting out or outsourcing production and services. They push for more flexibility, and they want to roll back many of the concessions that we've fought for and won. They develop new forms of employment and work practices, which they then imposed on workers, creating greater stress and frustration and insecurity for our people. And not to mention foreign investors who demand no trade unions, deregulation of labor law, and other regulatory changes that have negative social impact. Let me give you a concrete example. I sat in a meeting with a company who came to the union and said, listen, I have an investor, but the investor is telling me, can you get the union to agree to de-unionize? Can you imagine that? And that is the environment that we have to navigate, right? But 𝗟𝗏𝗄, at the end, collective bargaining is a cornerstone institution for democracy. It is a mechanism for increasing workers' income, and we should not be afraid or somehow ashamed to talk about increasing our income, because there is no shame when the banks declares very publicly hundreds of millions of dollars in profits every quarter. They didn't have no shame in that. But somehow when we talk about our income and talk about the value of our labor, we have to feel a little kind of ashamed, and we have to couch it in different terms and not too much talk about it. You know, if we want to talk about reducing inequality in a serious way, in a meaningful way, then we have to talk about strengthening collective agreements, strengthening collective bargaining. And there really is no other way, you know. And you see the fall in numbers of workers belonging to trade unions that they tout and they like to use to beat upon us. I want us to be clear that that is due in main to the neoliberal global economic integration, which have actually tipped bargaining power in favor of employers. It's important we identify the source, because we spend a lot of time in sort of a kind of internal self-critique. When we do that, we allow capital to escape. We allow them to escape, because then they are not facing the critique and the criticism, and therefore they are seen as the norm, and as that is good for society, when it is not. It is not. You know, even in the landscape that we have to navigate, and I want to say this, that even in that landscape, we have been able, as a movement, to navigate against all odds, against the full power of capital, with billions of dollars at their disposal, and the full might and infrastructure of the state. We still have collective agreements that have adapted to the competitive pressures. And just think of some of them. We talk about inflation. There's a lot of discourse internationally and as well as in the region about inflation. But you know, some collective agreements have cost of living allowance by indexation. Now, somehow they have convinced themselves, and somehow they try to convince us that that is something of the past. But just think of that little mechanism, an index COLA within your collective agreement that addresses the ravages of inflation automatically, you know, automatically. And then some collective agreements have what are called EHOPs, a housing plan to ensure that you have shelter. In fact, some collective agreements were the first place to recognize paternity leave, because there are no labor legislation that recognized it, that had it. And of course, profit sharing, variable pay. So all these are examples of provisions that are part of strong collective agreements. And these are just a few examples. I mean, I could go on and on. That'll be a whole session on that alone. But we also do have to speak to, and Sandra mentioned it earlier, how do we respond really to the climate crisis, to a pandemic, for example, or even the introduction of artificial intelligence. But those things can really only be addressed through free, note my words, free and fair collective bargaining. And I think Grayson very nicely put that in the context of international labor standards, right? But in the recent actions of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is clearly contrary, their actions is contrary to the principles of collective bargaining. So after several years of calling on the government to begin negotiation, the government simply prepared a package through the CPO, Chief Personnel Officer, presented it to the unions, take it or leave it. When the unions and the workers responded, the government just sent it to the special tribunal, which is selected by the cabinet, and then they turn around and threaten unions with 2 10-year agreements. What about that is collective bargaining? Nothing. In fact, if you just simply go to the ILO website and search for a document, guidelines on collective bargaining, you'll see that everything that has happened over the last couple months is anything but collective bargaining. And, you know, comrades, sisters, and brothers, collective bargaining, collective agreements are critical and are concrete measures for addressing, as I said, inequality and reducing poverty. So let me give you another concrete example in the energy sector. So the collective agreement between OWTU and Petrotrin, along with its contract clause, the value of labor could be between $80 to $200 an hour. Now, with the closure of Petrotrin and the removal of the collective agreement, the average value of labor has plummeted to an average of about $40 to $80 an hour for the same job. And here's what's worse. That is just the quantitative figure. But let's go even beyond that. No pension plan, no medical plan, no housing allowance, no employees assistance program to deal with psychosocial issues. All of that value lost. And this presents a real major fall in the standard of living and quality of life to workers, not just in the energy sector, but because that sector represented a benchmark for other sectors across the economy, including the private sector. What you've in fact had is a devaluation, not of our currency, but a devaluation of our labor power. You see, and I'm coming to a close here. Collective agreements are the concretization and the materialization of the social contract. You weaken collective agreements, then you weaken our democracy. But if you strengthen collective agreements, then in fact you strengthen our democracy. You see, it democratizes the workplace. And this is the real fear for the ruling class, because the more you democratize the workplace, then workers would be able to retain more of the surplus value they create, and it does not end up in the bank accounts of the bourgeoisie, whilst the workers struggle to pay rent, put food on the table, to put clothes on their back, to travel to and from the very said work. With collective bargaining now under threat, our democracy is under threat. The existence of trade unions and collective agreements ensures that there is some level of democracy in the workplace. Democracy cannot be restricted to everything outside the place you spend most of your time. And then with remote work, that in itself poses another challenge. In Hegelian fashion, I want to make full circle, to close as I started. The value of our labor power is determined by our ability to take collective action and assert ourselves as a class. Thank you.
Thank you so very much to my good friend and colleague, 𝗟𝗯𝗃𝗂𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃. I suppose one of the best terms I can use to describe your presentation, apart from being very highly analytical, is simply unapologetic. And I think we know you, 𝗟𝗯𝗃𝗂𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃, and that's how you would give it, so that we really do appreciate, no sort of, fancy footwork, but just straight, very, very, to the point. So, 𝗟𝗯𝗃𝗂𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃, and let me just remind my fellow panelists, the other panelists, that 𝗟𝗪𝗃𝗂𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃 did indicate he had a commitment, and so I would like, if you would agree, there are at least two questions we'd like to put to 𝗟𝗪𝗃𝗂𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃 before he leaves. So, 𝗟𝗪𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, you spoke to it somewhat, but I'm going to just ask you. It was recently reported that the Joint Trade Union Federation, which essentially is an amalgam of all of the labor federations in Trinidad and Tobago, that they intended to report the government to the ILO for not facilitating the free flow of collective bargaining, and also on the issue of freedom of association. Can you expand on this a bit, especially as it appears to suggest that there's a strong hindrance to the collective bargaining process in the public and state sector, especially in Trinidad and Tobago? And also, of course, the question is in the context of your assertion that collective bargaining effectively builds the process of democracy in our country. Can you speak to that bit, please?
Yes. What we have witnessed over the last few months is anything but free and fair. You see, we cannot forget those three words: free and fair. So collective bargaining is just not just collective bargaining. It has to be free and it has to be fair. So I just have to say this. Sometimes what is fair may not be economical. And what is economical may not be fair. I just want to put that on the table, okay? What we had was that what I would call dictatorial bargaining, okay? Because it is where the state says, this is what it's going to be, take it or leave it. And before you can sit around the table, even if you did that, even if you say, okay, you made public, okay, this is where we want to go. But you still have to sit down in a process of mutual engagement where both parties present their arguments and enter into a long process of discourse. That's what social dialogue is. Dialogue is, I understand dialogue, going back to its Greek origin, requires two people to be exchanging in communication with each other on the basis of mutual respect for each other. But that is not what happened. That is far from what happened. It was come and collect a package. I mean, can you imagine? At that level, come and collect. It is the level of disrespect is incredible. So right there, there's no social dialogue. I mean, there was no one can say to us that the unions and the states sat down for hours. I remember when we engaged in some real collective bargaining, you're sitting down for 18 hours, 24 hours. You have a rhythm section outside. The workers want to know what's going on with their matter. And there's a lot of, it's really democratic, you know? That is not what happened. And in light of that, and in light of the fact it was the state that engaged in such a unilateral imposition, and then what is worse, weaponize now the industrial court by abusing its power and authority to impose upon trade unions collective periods that was not before the court. So here I mean, your hands are completely tied. And it is in that regard, we are going to submit our report to the Committee of Experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. So that is a mechanism within the ILO, the International Labour Organization, of which we are a member state, okay? Once a country has ratified an ILO convention, and in our case, one of the fundamental ones, there are 8, but one of the fundamental ones, every 3 years, the government have to provide reports detailing the steps that they have taken in law and practice to apply any of those conventions. And we are saying, and we are going to be submitting a report to the ILO to say that the government of Trinidad and Tobago have not complied with the fundamental conventions. The Committee of Experts will then do a report, and then you have what they call the Committee on the Application of Standards, who will review the report. And we will also be submitting our well, I want to say findings, but that sounds a little too academic, our complaint to the International Labour Organization. Let me just say that on record, the last time Trinidad and Tobago actually utilized this mechanism was way back in around the early 70s. So we're going to, we especially coming out of the last experience, I think we have enough evidence. It's like, for us, it was a crime against humanity. I know it's strong words, but when you impose that kind of adjustment to the public sector workers, and I'm really happy Sandra is here and remind us that the only way we can address the crisis is through a public pathway approach. The private sector is not going to step in, just as what happened with COVID. So I think I sort of answered the 2 questions in one there. As I said, I have to leave. We have a meeting with workers, and I think that's one thing we must never lose sight of, our continuous engagement with the workers themselves, with our membership, because that's what gives us the strength in order to fight on in this epic class war in which we are engaged in. And let me conclude by saying there are those who really are of the view that the Caribbean society should somehow be reshaped to look like how it was 200 years ago. They really believe that. They believe that we have gotten too many benefits. They believe that we have gotten too many rights. They believe that our retention of the surplus value of our own labor should belong to them. I just want to say that there is enough conscious people still around. 2 of them, I can speak to the comrades I know, Grayson, so don't feel a how. 2 of them on this panel, for sure, who are willing to continue to fight for many more years, to ensure that our Caribbean society continue to belong to the ordinary man and woman of the Caribbean. And I'll close there.
𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗰𝗆, thank you so very much, as always, for your very frank discourse, and very, as I said, unapologetic, but positively so. I don't use that term in a negative sense. I think we really appreciate, and I think I know our fellow panelists appreciate, and I'm sure members of the public appreciate that we, no soft soaping of the issues, but of course it's coming from a position of well-researched and documented experience over the years. So thank you very much, 𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗰𝗆, Education and Research Officer of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement, and so many other not just titles, but functions that he engages in. So thank you very much, and we wish you all the best and success with the meeting, a very important trade union meeting that you have to leave us to attend. Our appreciation that you took the time to be with us, at least for part of the time. Yeah, the value we received is as if you were here for the entire session. So thank you again, 𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗰𝗆.
Thank you. La luta continua. Forward ever, backward never.
Thank you, comrade. And I want to go straight into a couple of questions we have received for you, Dr. Koyi and Sandra. I will come to you after. We haven't forgotten you, because I also have a couple of questions down the line that have been put in the chat for you. So, and because we are reduced to two panelists, we do have some time for you to consider and respond. So, Dr. Koyi, one of the first questions I got for you was, are you satisfied with the extent to which the trade union emphasizes formal training for its functionaries? Are you satisfied with the extent to which the trade union emphasizes formal training for its functionaries? And I know that word training came up a few times in your presentation, so also along with the word evidence, so that I'm just putting this first question to you, and there's also another question to you before we move on to Sister Sandra.
Okay, thank you. So I can take that one before we go to the next question. Thank you so much, moderator. Very, very interesting and useful question. Are you satisfied with the extent of emphasis on training in terms of the trade union operation? Well, I think that it's again, it depends, but I should like to believe that there's a role and place for education and training of the workers that takes a different dimension, as you would appreciate. I think that the work of the trade union needs to be grounded in terms of knowledge and appreciation of the values that the trade union stands for, the unity, the solidarity, the cooperation. And I want to link this to what Sandra said, to what extent and how are we mentoring and preparing, for instance, for the young people that are coming in. For the work that the trade union stands for, and the kind of, if I have to go along what 𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗰𝗆 said, the struggle, if I have to borrow that nomenclature, the class struggle, and the challenges that pertain, the tactics, the strategies, and the institutional memory and the ideological grounding that reinforces and defines the expression of what the trade union needs to be passed on, if you like, to the young generation. The trade union needs to take on the emerging issues, for instance, of climate change, of digitalization, and the different transitions that are coming across. And so if we have to take the fact that there is a role for education and training that has to ensure that this knowledge and the power that it comes with is transmitted to the membership and the broad trade union grassroots, then perhaps there still remains work that needs to be done, and there's still room for emphasis. But again, if it has to be in the context of training, we also have to understand it. For instance, in the context of the kind of skills acquisition, apprenticeship, the mentorship, and the training. And this is something I think that the trade union have to take on and see how they codify the knowledge and to reinforce the power. And I think it has to all be around reinforcing the power. And if I have to relate it to collective bargaining, which is the subject that we are dealing with, I think that the knowledge around how the trade unions are going to receive their fair share of the inputs in terms of production or quality has to rest on the appreciation that from the historical perspective, the trade union have always gotten that which belongs to them, through class struggle, but it is through power relation and not necessarily through the formulation of productivity or preferences. And so I want to believe that there is room and there's a place for enhancing the knowledge base and the power that the trade union has to wield. And if that is going to come through education and conscientization or training, I think that then there's room for the trade union to be able to do more. I thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Koyi. And I think we'll just mix it up a bit. So before I come back to you, Dr. Koyi, we will go to Sister Sandra. And there's a question from one of our listeners indicating, how can unions effectively communicate the facts and importance of unionization to young persons, given that the older generation already grasps the significance? And Sister Sandra, I recall somewhere in your presentation, you made reference to the whole issue of a line I wrote down, who are we mentoring? And I wrote down, I gather it sounded a bit like succession planning, but I'm not going to put words in your mouth. Lord, who are we mentoring? And when I saw this question, it I sort of connected the two. So the question basically is, how can trade unions effectively communicate the facts and the importance of unionization to younger persons?
Okay. That's a tough one in the sense that there's so many avenues that unions can take, huh? But if I try to pull out a couple of them, one has to be the resuscitation and the reinvigoration of our trade union education and training programs. I came into the trade union movement through trade union education and training. As a new member of the union, you're invited to your orientation sessions. Then you find yourself being a shop steward and you go to a shop steward training session. And then you go to so it is not only the resuscitation, but I say reinvigoration in that, or leadership. And I want to be clear what I mean by leadership. I'm not just talking about the president and the general secretary or even the executive. I'm talking about the national councils or general councils or national executives, whatever term the particular union uses. What is your strategy for education and training? What are you aiming to achieve? Who are the people that you are particularly targeting? And one would hope that obviously, in addition to your shop stewards and so on, you're targeting the future, but not only the future in terms of, current and future, not only in terms of membership, but who are you seeing out there having introduced your new members, having had your orientation sessions? What are the things that you have identified that you're looking for that you will say, aha, here's a possibility. We're going to have a structured set of training for these groups of people who we've identified as having some potential to be trainers themselves, to go further in leadership, to change the union. In other words, what is the strategy of our unions these days? Are we just maintaining the status quo, or are we talking about being transformational? The second thing, which is linked to that, and it happens a lot in public services unions, is that they go to the state. I'm wary of saying the word government. They go to the state and make the claim, and it is a valid claim, that there must be some kind of subvention for the trade union movement, either through its national centers or through key unions representing some of the key sectors, for this subvention, an annual subvention. While I believe that has its value, what are we doing about mobilizing our own resources? And I'm pausing a bit because that also is an issue for the ILO and other UN organizations. And because we've now got ourselves into this thing where we are dependent on the philanthropists, we seem to be in a state where we can only do something if somebody gives us the money to do it. And if that's the case, what value are we putting to it? And the third area, I think that would help in changing or building a proper perception and an understanding of trade unionism is through mentorships. And do we have any framework guidelines in our respective unions about how we mentor young people or how we mentor young women in unions? What are the things that we are going to be working towards to have make sure that we are on the lookout and we give the support to those workers, those young workers? Because that's where I fear. I mean, I don't think any of us want to be around in our 70s and 80s doing the same things that we did back in our 20s. And are we really in a proper exchange? Are we in dialogue? Are we really and truly educated? Or are we bringing young people into a room and telling them things and figure, okay, that's it. We've done our business. We've educated them. That's not educating anybody. Are we integrating them into the union, or are we just treating them as though they're little ghettos of young people that organize the Christmas party and organize the games evening? Are we really integrating them and talking with them and getting them involved in certain projects and areas of work? So to try to put it together, those are perhaps the three things that most come to mind in response to the question asked.
Thanks so very much, Sister Sandra. And I immediately go back to Dr. Koyi, because there is another question here for you. It says, do you think that it is time for capacity, including capabilities assessment, to be done on each trade union to ensure that efficacy is optimum? And I sort of connect this again with you did mention building capacity. You made reference somewhere in your presentation to training being done at Turin College by Turin College, etc. So this question seems to be talking about assessment of capacity. I'm not sure by whom, but I will leave that in your hands, perhaps to venture a response or an opinion on that. Who is to do this assessment on trade unions? Yeah, Dr. Koyi.
Well, an interesting one. But I think that at the heart of the question is the question of trade union effectiveness in terms of achieving the purposeful goal, and whether in fact we would be satisfied in saying that in the current context that the effectiveness is as it should be. I think that challenges remain, and I think that is, and it's challenges that define the trade union struggle. And I think that if we have to get to assessing or measuring, I think that the knowledge or capacities of the trade union have to be understood and perhaps appreciated in the context of the power that they wield to influence. For instance, if it's a policy influence, to what extent are they able to influence? And so it goes beyond the metrics, perhaps, as we would want to define them in a conventional assessment. Because if we have to go the route of conventional assessment, we run the risk of then, extending the comfort to being linking the wages and the condition of service to the metrics. I think that it has to go beyond. And the contribution that labor brings to the fore goes beyond the metrics that perhaps we would want to use in terms of assessing. So when we want to look at trade union effectiveness, we have to first and foremost appreciate that despite the challenges and despite the onslaught that has come the way of labor, which I think that Brother Ozzy was well able to put across. I think that it is the success is in the fact that the trade union have withstood the onslaught, and that they're acting on present possibilities to be able to gain or regain the momentum. And that is where I think that the ILO is also coming in to see how best they can build the institutional capacity, as it were, of the trade union to be able to achieve their purposeful goal. So I would want to understand it in terms of the power to be able to achieve, for instance, collective bargaining outcomes as seeks to improve the quality of society, that seeks to ensure that there's peace and there's prosperity for all, and that aligns with the decent work agenda that we think provides a means to be able to achieve that. I think that's how I would answer it. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so very much, Dr. Koyi. That reference you made to peace and prosperity for all. I think what needs to be understood is that the outcome of strong collective bargaining is not just to the benefit of the workers in in any particular trade union, but it's really redounds to the benefit of the society as a whole. So, and I know Comrade Ozzy, that's one of the points he was very strongly emphasizing. So thank you again. Sister Sandra, I have a question here, which I think is what I would call loosely down your alley. So I'll throw this one out at you. It says, how can trade unions ensure inclusivity and representation of diverse group of workers in their efforts to enhance collective agreement protections? So that's the first part of the question, the whole issue of inclusivity and representation of diverse groups. And the second part of the question says, what steps can be taken uh, to address issues such as gender equality, migrant workers and migrant workers' rights, and fair treatment of marginalized communities? This is a bit of a long question, but I try to put it in two parts, and you can address it as you see fit. Yeah.
Okay. As with most things, colleagues, the first thing is building the awareness. The going along with that, and as I try to answer this question, I'm thinking of some of our affiliates and those who have been able to at least wet their feet in terms of the inclusivity issue. We have currently in all of our unions, public, private, people of different ethnicities, people of different sexual orientations. But the thing is, we don't know who they are, or we haven't made enough effort to find them or embrace them. So it's a matter of, I think, as I said before, they being aware of why these issues are important for unions, and also, and I'm going to borrow a term from a colleague. I really do have to say, and if it is offensive to some, it was not intended. It is not intended to be, but it's a real statement of fact, and particularly us in the Caribbean. Black people should be the last group of people to discriminate against anybody. And I think that as trade unions, we have to really get back to some basics about why we're here. If we're talking about class struggles, and remember, we're not living in worlds in which we only have one identity. Yeah? There's so many intersectionalities. So we have the Black older woman who has a disability, and how do you ensure that what we do covers those particular characteristics, or those different diverse characteristics of individuals? So it's awareness and bringing to the fact that for everybody there's a struggle, and in a number of cases there are multiple struggles when you start identifying who you are. Secondly, of course, is tying it into why we're unions, why it is that we get together, and that whole concept and belief, strong belief in the collective strength and power. And I think the third thing is that unions are going to have to go through their policies, and particularly as enunciated in their constitutions and rule books. How do these reflect who we are, what we think, and where we're going? So again, three things. Do we really know who our members are? Do we know why we're here? And this is particularly for those of, particularly again, for our younger members or our newer members and potential members. Are we going through that exercise of thinking it through very carefully about the different ways in which people are discriminated against? And how do we as trade unions stand out as the ones who are fighting that fight, dealing with the cause of inclusivity, and making sure that not only that we talk it, but our institutions or rule books, the ways in which we operate, reflect the inclusivity issues, and also pass it on within society? Do we comment on these things in terms of societal discussions and arguments that are going on? So just to touch on it a bit, again, we could do a whole day discussing this.
Mr. Sandra, I had an experience. I'll just share briefly, very, very briefly, about 20 years ago as a younger trade unionist. I'm not that young anymore, but I do recall this was my first sort of experience where a young man came into my office at the trade union, and he indicated he had come to me because he basically was looking for a certain benefit within a collective agreement. But then he went on to define he was excluded from that benefit because of, he went on for the first time, he was telling I was the first person in the union he had indicated that to, meaning he defined his sexual orientation, and that benefit was not allowed to him because of that orientation. It was allowed to heterosexual couples. So that that was my first experience in dealing with such an issue, because he wanted the union to pick this up for him as a dispute, because he felt he was being discriminated against. And it's really interesting as a young trade unionist or a younger one where you don't have the experience. And I'm just sharing this because that is the challenge some trade unionists may have. Somebody walking into their office and saying to them, this is who I really am. And as a result of this, I want to see certain things, or I want to be able to utilize a particular clause in the collective agreement in a particular way. Of course, it's something that is maybe a bit more commonplace now, but you can imagine 20 years plus ago, it was like a really an awakening for me that, someone would come and, he was actually saying, before I came to you, I went to the kitchen in the lunchroom in the office, and I made an open declaration to my colleagues. You see that person who has been meeting me in afternoons, who I was describing as a lineman partner, is really not my lineman partner. They're a different type of partner. So I just share this. I won't go on in it, but I just share it as is something that trade unionists we are coming to expect that sooner or later you have to deal with these sort of approaches and then determine how you incorporate them, because more demands are coming to us in terms of inclusivity and how these things are engaged within collective bargaining. So I just thought I would share that thought, or that experience I had, rather, as I go back to Dr. Koyi. And I think we're probably coming down to the last set of questions, maybe one or two more questions, because we do have to give each of you, of course, an opportunity to do some closing remarks based on the whole discussion. So, Dr. Koyi, you did mention, at maybe more than once, the issue of the SDGs and how it impacts, or the impression I was getting, you were trying to make a connection or nexus between collective bargaining and, the whole development process. So I think we probably just want to ask you to expand on a bit on that, because I do have a question here that basically speaks to that. Um, and it says, looking ahead, what potential strategies of innovative approaches can trade unions adopt to further strengthen protections provided in collective agreements? And there's a nexus here between, in terms of the SDGs and the whole development process. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I think that it is important that the trade union can stand up for the institution, if we have to put it that way, of collective bargaining, or the collective bargaining mechanism, because it is constantly under attack, and we have seen this attack come in various forms from where we stand. It comes, for instance, in the context of negotiation parameters that may be imposed, particularly in the context of the public sector, for instance, international financial institutions within the context of countries that may, for instance, be following strict adjustment or stabilization programs or conditionalities. The collective bargaining mechanism gets to be constrained by the parameters pertaining to the policy environment, and to an extent that happens, then it places constraints in terms of that which can be achieved, and therefore first and foremost, I think the trade union itself as an institution have to stand up to that and contest that, so that is a side of struggle. The policy environment and the context within which collective bargaining may be taking place, or within the public sector, for instance. I refer more to the public sector because that's also my background in terms of working with the trade unions. So that's why I find it easier to relate to the public sector, because I worked in the public service for close to 14 years, and I was part of the team that was doing collective bargaining, but I was coming in from the research unit within the public sector. And so I've experienced where we go into collective bargaining, and at the beginning of collective bargaining, you find that the employer tells you that we cannot reward workers this particular fiscal year beyond, say, for instance, 8%, because we have entered into an agreement with the international creditors that we will not be able to, go beyond this particular public sector wage threshold. So already that then becomes a challenge, and a challenge not only to the collective bargaining actors, but also a challenge to society as a whole, because decent work is a means of improving the welfare of society through incomes, through dealing with inequality. So it goes beyond just the trade union. So and so if there has to be a strategic innovation, as it were, is to be able to send the message across to society as a whole that the fight for decent work goes beyond just the confines of, for instance, the parameters or collective bargaining, or the workers or unionized workers. It has the ultimately the benefit of spreading to society. And that is where I was also able to indicate that for effective engagement, and for ensuring the effective achievement of the purposeful goals, then the trade union must also be able to innovate and network with other like-minded organizations to be able to bring this goal, as it were, that would seem to be a trade union goal, but in essence, it's a society's goal. And so it's perhaps that, and that is, the value that would also be found in this approach within the SDG of leaving no one behind, but also having this inclusive and partnership approach. But it is, how are we harnessing it to be able to ensure that we achieve the purposeful interests and goals that the trade union stands for. I should like to thank you and submit in the interest of time. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Koyi. And I do have a question that I'd like to put for a perspective from both of you. So I'll start with Sister Sandra, and then I'll come back to you, Dr. Koyi. Because the topic today, of course, just to remind, in case there might be those joining us, part of the way is strengthening collective agreements. And one has to assume, of course, that before you have a strong collective agreement, you must engage in the collective bargaining process. And the question being asked, Sister Sandra, I'm asking you perhaps from a Caribbean perspective, because of your of course, wide breadth of knowledge of the Caribbean region. And Dr. Koyi, I would perhaps be asking you this more to give an ILO perspective, or ILO global perspective. And the question is the collective agreement evolving fast enough to suit the environment we are in? Is the collective agreement evolving fast enough to suit the environment we are in? And in that context, I'm thinking of, some new aspects of, that are coming up, climate change, remote work, digitalization, just to throw out a few things. Sister Sandra, from a Caribbean perspective, you're free to expand on it, but is the collective agreement evolving fast enough In short, what are some of the issues and how are we dealing with it as trade unions in the collective bargaining process?
Well, the short response is no. It's not evolving fast enough. That's the short and simple and honest response. And together with that, I'm here rummaging around in my head is how quickly do we want it to evolve? But then I'm also asking myself, what really is our objective with our collective agreements? Apart from, we're setting standards, we're setting some improvements for workers and rewards and so on, and looking at making people's lives better. But really and truly, when we approach the collective bargaining process, it seems to me, from when I talk with people throughout the Caribbean and when I read the various newspaper or news articles, it always seems as though we're trying to play catch up. So in 2023, you're hearing about some agreement going back into 2014. And so what is it that we're trying to do? Is it that we're trying to catch up? Are we trying to prepare a foundation for people to have a better life? Is it that we approach collective bargaining with a certain amount of future thinking? So it brings all of those things into question to me. And if we want to strengthen the agreements and strengthen the process, does it mean that we have to, maybe just sit down and think all of these things through and determine what it is? Because that in that way we will always be like, so in 2026 we'll be looking at 2020 situation, and that's untenable. And how are we explaining that to a younger person in the workforce, or a school, someone who's just leaving secondary school or leaving university? How do we explain that as a union we are bargaining for wages and salaries, particularly, that we should have gotten even before they left school? What is our future? What are we thinking about in terms of the collective agreement? And given that we've had COVID and the kind of, well, even before COVID, things like chikungunya and all of those experiences we've had, how are we building the experiences from those into what we're doing in collective bargaining and therefore the agreement? What is it that we want? And I've asked questions of some unions, and I know I get a number of different answers, but I'm hearing, especially from those that are affiliated to national centers, their views are not necessarily what I hear from the national center. So what is it that we need to be doing to strengthen the agreement? Is it calling then for institutions like where you're at now at the CCLCS? Is it calling for institutions like yours to actually have a serious study on collective agreements? What was the rationale? What was the thinking? How were the unions thinking that things would go forward? And what do the current leaderships have in mind in terms of going forward? So, short answer, no, we ain't even nowhere near. But then, having said that, what next? What do we do? Do we continue to lament? Do we continue to say that negotiations taking too long? Do we bite bullets and start over? What is it that we need to do if we're talking about strengthening? And maybe the answers will be different depending on the country or the territory that you're in. These are things that I think we do need to actually sit down and have some serious discussion, argument, shout outs, whatever. But at the end of it, come to some resolution as to what are the 5-point plans that we're going to adopt in terms of changing the status quo so that it is better for workers and their families.
Thank you, Sister Sandra. And even before I come to you, Dr. Koyi, if I can just perhaps just express an observation or view, because yes, of course, Sister Sandra knows very well I'm a trade unionist by myself, and I think we are being caught or have been caught, and from my experience as a young man, a young worker, and continuing on in the Caribbean. I don't know if the experience is the same for you when you come to respond, Dr. Koyi, but we seem to be caught in this quagmire of what I call retroactivity, where because we operated in the days when maybe a collective agreement would generate a wage increase of 30, 40, 50% and even more, 70, 80% in the 80s, etc., the oil boom, etc., in Trinidad and Tobago. So workers always liked the idea of not minding if a collective agreement was delayed, because then, and somehow or the other, collective agreements always seem to get settled close to or around Christmas time. And that's the time when workers would put the most pressure on their unions, and employers, being aware of that, would come with an offer, which was probably a bit less than they really could afford. But because it was Christmas time, and the tradition, people want to get their new television, their new refrigerator, their new whatever at Christmas time. So we fell into this culture of, okay, collective agreements were often settled around Christmas time or just before, and the workers love the idea, or appear to love the idea of, okay, I'm going to get what we called in our region a back pay. And that back pay could be, turn out to be several thousands. I mean, quite a lot of money in some cases. Of course, we are now in the era of, let's call it single digit more. We are more in the era of single digit settlements. And so retroactivity is no longer as attractive, and certainly not for the younger worker. But we still seem to be caught up in that battle or fight or tussle between, should I don't mind waiting and getting a back pay, or do I get, you tell a worker we're going to settle current as you 2023, we're going to settle 2023. And their first question to you is, well, you mean there's no back pay? No, there won't be, because we are settling current. But the benefit of that is that you are going to get your current salary to be able to meet the current cost of living. So I just mentioned that in passing, because I think that's part of the challenge we are facing. This part of the old culture of retroactivity and back pay versus the, let's call it maybe the new culture of trying to keep current so that we deal with the current challenges with current wages. Sorry, Dr. Koyi, but I just thought I would splice this in, especially since we were speaking with Sister Sandra from a more Caribbean context. So over to you.
Thank you so much, moderator. That was useful. I should like to contend also, and I think that broadly this is what appears to be ACTRA's point of view. Firstly, I think that I should like to posit that collective bargaining remains a cornerstone of industrial relations. It's still significant and has a place. Is it evolving fast enough? Perhaps not. Again, as would notice, the complexion of the workforce is changing. It's tending to be young. It's changing to be female, and it's tending to be if we would like to put it, more informed and educated. And we see that perhaps collective bargaining is not addressing sufficiently some of the emerging needs of the changing complexion of workers. Collective bargaining as an institution may also be lagging behind if we have to look at, for instance, growing income inequality, the gender wage gaps, and so on. But I should like to contend, and I think that that does not go to question the relevance and the imperative of collective bargaining as an institution. Perhaps we expectant and maybe impatient, but I think that we are on the right course with collective bargaining. The pace may not be fast enough, but I want to believe that collective bargaining is on the right course, so and headed in the right direction. So that would be the contention. And from the point of view of ILO and ACTRAV, we will continue to strengthen trade unions to ensure that they can play their role effectively through collective bargaining and also engagement in sustainable development cooperation, so that the welfare of society can ultimately be improved through collective bargaining. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koyi. And quickly over to you, Sister Sandra. We are winding down a bit, but you mentioned in your presentation, Sister Sandra, looking at the whole issue of perhaps some specific collective agreements or collective agreements that might deal with specific issues such as like digitalization, training, etc. My understanding was that you were saying is that not given some of the needs that we have today, not everything may fit into the traditional individual collective agreement between an organization and a union, but there may be some maybe sector specific or not national specific issues that we can look at, maybe like the issue of remote work. So I just thought I'd ask you to just expand on that a bit, because some unions do very jealously guard their the way they may do or see things, and what you are suggesting seem to be that this would need some level of dialogue at maybe a federation level, and perhaps when you are through, Dr. Koyi might want to chime in as to if how the ILO might see something like this broad sectoral type agreements. Yeah. Sister Sandra.
Sure. It's been something that I've been thinking about for a while. And it came to me in terms of thinking about it when I think it would have been like in the late 70s, when we had, the late 90s. What am I saying? The late 19, I think it was started in 1997, when we had changes in the preferential treatment arrangements between the European Union and the Caribbean. So we moved from Lomé into Cotonou. And that's when also we had so that was a trade discussion. And that trade discussion was dealing with, in fact, how we moved from the GATS into the WTO, and the way the world was moving on certain issues like that. You saw that, you know what, there's certain ground rules, there's certain basic principles that we all have to work with. It's similar, I guess, in a way to what happens with international labor standards. They're seen as the minimum. So once we have that, and again, when we put this new thing that came on board around that same time, the whole matter of social partnerships. Because we seem to get social partnerships now as just people coming together and meet, but coming together and meet and do what? What is it all about? And if we want to have some basic ground rules so that each union isn't going to be fighting for the same basic principles that what other unions do in terms of their collective bargaining with a company, it's building on what is already set there as a foundation. So my thinking is, if we are seeing, and let's bring it into the present day, over the last, 3-4 years, we've been hearing a lot about digital transformation, digitalization, and all sorts of things with digits. But we don't seem to have a common understanding or appreciation as a trade union movement. And I'm speaking particularly public services, as well as also making some references to the trade union movement in the Caribbean as represented through the Caribbean Congress of Labor. What is the position? So if the Caribbean Congress of Labor has status at the CARICOM meetings, and if the public services unions have status at ECLAC or other areas, that's the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, shouldn't the basic principles about digital transformation and how we see it as trade unions be always there, no matter who is attending what? But as it is now, it all depends on what unions know or don't know, who they have as their allies, and so on. So I'm thinking, you know what, if we are meeting as we're talking about skills and apprenticeships and all these different things that are also being discussed at the ILO, and we can use the current, there's a new recommendation on apprenticeships. Shouldn't those things actually be part of a national agreement? Preferably should be regional, since most things are discussed at the CARICOM level. And therefore we have within our various countries some national collective bargaining, and people will call it social partnership and whatever. But that the various principles on which we stand in relation to those issues from a Caribbean perspective are agreed on nationally. So whether you are a private company, whether it's a state-owned enterprise, whether it's a ministry of the public service, whether it's whatever, these are the ground rules. This is the foundation on which we build. And then unions use that foundation to try to seek improvements in their own spaces. I think we perhaps have to be moving more and more in that direction, because digital transformation, at the end of the day, there is a CARICOM agreement on digital space. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we now have 24 out of 30 something Caribbean states that have now changed their data privacy laws. And it isn't only about privacy, it's about who owns the data, it's about how workers are managed in the workplace, or let me say in the world of work, because it isn't necessarily an actual place. So how do we effectively manage it? And this is why sometimes I see 2 agreements in the same country, in the same sector, 2 different companies, and one is better than the other. And sometimes, heaven forbid, but sometimes you may even see that it's the same union in both instances. And it's really then speaking to the strength of the union's argument, even on basic issues. So shouldn't we be thinking of and weighing, is it then really something that we should try to have a national policy through a collective bargaining process on what employers' responsibilities are, what's the state's responsibility, what's the workers' responsibility in a Trinidad and Tobago or St. Lucia or Barbados setting with regard to these issues, which are seeking, as far as we can see, all the linkages to the same SDGs, to sustainable development. They're all tied together. how are we then going to approach our collective bargaining and our collective agreements when we take all of those things into consideration? And I'd like to posit that perhaps again the Cipriani College could perhaps take some lead in doing an investigation into it, thinking about it. What does this mean? What would it require? Would it be able to pull a number of resources together that individual unions may not have? And something along those lines that I think the Caribbean has been known to be innovators. Let us be innovative when it comes to things like these. And so that's what I'm throwing. Well, I'm not necessarily throwing it out, but putting it on the table really for serious discussion if we're talking about strengthening agreements and maintaining and even strengthening the process of collective bargaining.
Thank you, Sister Sandra. You're certainly putting not just myself, but the college in the spotlight with this. I know, Dr. Koyi, what I'll do, we're coming to give you both the opportunity for some closing remarks. So perhaps if the ILO have a perspective on this particular issue, you can include it in your closing remarks. I just wanted to indicate to Sister Sandra that two thoughts that come to mind quickly. One is that during the time of COVID-19, I know the college did facilitate a meeting between the Employers Consultative Association and the various employer chambers and the joint trade union federations. Admittedly, we on a policy direction with COVID. Admittedly, we did not get around to signing an agreement of sort, but there was a common understanding of some of the issues that were, started to occur in the workplace around COVID. And rather than have each individual union discuss it with each individual employer, there was that meeting of minds where we were able at least to understand, and it led to some level of appreciation of how each other would have thought in that perspective. So it sort of, and the college did facilitate that. So I think that was like, let's call it a little start on what you were talking about, and we need to pursue that further. And what I'm also thinking about, which I think you are aware of, is the global framework agreements. And also in the Caribbean, we have the first Caribbean International Bank regional framework agreement. It isn't a perfect agreement, but what it does is that it allows, rather than each union and each finance union in each Caribbean country discussing with the bank, we meet together, and at the end there are some, let's call it broad ticket items that we can have a common understanding on, and then it filters into the individual collective agreements. Because the last example, which was a negative one I recall, was that several years ago, the national airline, but which operates across the Caribbean, there were different uniform policies in different islands, or different, and I remember the unions again got together and started to speak. Network, that was a word that came up in, I think it might have been Dr. Koyi, the whole need for networking. And so we were able to discuss, well, why are you giving Trinidad and Tobago one set of, approach, and then in Barbados, the workers there have a different approach, and in Jamaica. And this was simply the issue of uniforms, and it was different in each Caribbean country because the employer felt, well, we can get away with giving one top less or one uniform less here, and anyone. Because the unions were able to get together and network, they were able to force or assist the employer in coming to one common understanding. It doesn't matter which Caribbean island you are dealing with. If we're dealing with this issue of uniforms, there must be one standard policy, regardless despite the fact that you are dealing with a different union in that country. So hopefully we're going to see more of this develop, where there can be that networking and perhaps broader sectoral considerations, which can maybe not just be focused on the individual collective agreement, but a broad national approach, or federation approach, I should say, to dealing with these issues. So let me allow each of you to have maybe a 2 to 3 minute closing remarks, and then we would conclude. So I would Dr. Koyi, I would, would you want the lady to go first? Your choice. I'm putting you on the spot.
I was going to say she goes first, ladies first, but I can go.
Okay, you can go,
I can
Dr. Koyi.
I
Yes.
can go first, and then
Yes.
she'll be able to wrap it up and place it within the context.
Yes.
No, thank you so much. I think that in my concluding remarks, once again, I would like to appreciate the consideration that you made for the ILO to be part of this very enriching discussion. We think that this is very useful, also in enabling us to gain some further insights in terms of the reality of collective bargaining as it is obtaining in the region, but also to be able to draw some learnings. When you sit in a conversation and a discussion like this, you also emerge enriched, and having learned and having perspectives and enriched, and you begin to look at realities with different lenses. And so I'm grateful for that. And on behalf of the ILO ACTRA, we are grateful. The role that the trade union have to play in the sustainable development agenda is critical. And they have to, of course, act on the present possibilities to assert themselves with a natural presence in that process. And if they can't do it themselves, nobody else will. But in order for them to be able to do it and engage effectively, they've got to speak with one voice. How they negotiate around that to ensure that they speak with one voice so that they are heard and heard well remains a matter that we still have to have a conversation on to see what would work best for that to be done. So this conversation would enrich us, but also taken in the context in which it has to take place, and what are the lessons that we can learn from the history, what are the experiences, what are the lessons that we can learn, and what are the resources that are available, and how do we mobilize to be able to achieve the purposeful interest of labor. Without doubt, challenges remain, within the context of collective bargaining and sustainable development goals. Challenges remain in the context of trade union. It's also in terms of competing interests and priorities, whether to engage with limited resources into processes that appear to be remote, or to place resources to demands that appear to be close and at the heart of traditional questions of industrial relations. But there's also challenges that remain in terms of technical capacities and the finances. But that there could be no denying. Despite all these challenges, there is no denying that trade unions are key actors in sustainable development, and that their engagement in Agenda 2030 programming and partnership processes represents a high-yielding investment in our common future and in the future of societies everywhere. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I submit.
Thank you, Dr. Koyi, and I go straight to you, Sister Sandra, for your closing remarks.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you all at the college, and to my friends, colleagues, sisters, and brothers out there in the audience. As I started, I made reference to the whole matter of mentoring, and I want to re-emphasize the importance of that in terms of strengthening not only our collective agreements, but also the entire process of collective bargaining. I also want to raise the issue, and I think this is the first time I may be actually using the word multilateralism. Let's not be fooled by the term multi-stakeholderism. We are as people, focused on multilateralism. That is, we're working together, and our main organization for that, the organization for that, is the United Nations and its various agencies and institutions, of which the ILO, in fact, predates the UN. And I think we have a critical role to continue to strengthen the ILO. One thing that we have not done enough of in, I think, the Caribbean is that we haven't used the supervisory mechanisms of the ILO enough. Some people argue that, oh, well, compared to the rest of the world, we're okay. We don't have all these skirmishes and coups and so on. That's true. However, we have to use the systems that have been set up within the ILO supervisory mechanism, because that information is critical to building the portfolio of evidence that we talked about at the beginning when we started our session this morning. We also have to recognize that, yes, while nothing is perfect, we do have to recognize that it is only through the UN and only through the ILO, especially the ILO, that our three social partners are heard. There's this talk now about a fourth sector and so on, and I'm not going to start a new argument about that. But even if that does come into being and so on, we have to recognize, let us maintain the sanctity of the tripartite system, and that means respecting collective bargaining. The process, whatever is the end result is another matter, but ensure that there is a process and it follows what is stated in the fundamental conventions, of which there are now 10. And that health and safety is a critical one. So when we're talking about collective agreements and strengthening them, it means as well that in looking at the fundamental rights and principles as our backdrop, and together with what is said as the target, the goals and targets and indicators within the SDGs, that we have to see where they are aligned to our fundamental rights and principles of work, and ensure that everything we do in terms of our collective bargaining process and everything that we do in terms of our collective agreements are aligned to ensure that we have social justice and that we're looking after the people of our respective countries, not just the citizens, all people in our countries. We do have a lot of work to do. There are lots of people I know who are interested. We just have to reach out there and spot them, bring them on board, mentor them, and do what is necessary to make things better. As I always say to people, what are you doing to make things better? So in our context, what will we be doing and what are we currently doing to strengthen collective bargaining and to strengthen our various collective agreements? Big role for the Cipriani College, which I hope that it will really seriously, the board will sit down and really discuss it. And I look forward to working with you, not only as Sandra Massiah, but also as PSI in helping to make things happen that benefit everyone. Thank you again for inviting me. Wonderful experience as usual.
Thank you so very much, Sister Sandra Massiah. And I think we do have a new board coming in, just in queue. So perhaps the director would, would also take the cue on that to the new board. Thank you so very much, Dr. Grayson Koyi, for agreeing to be with us. I know you're in a different time zone, so it's probably closer to dinner time for you. So thank you for making the sacrifice to be on. Thank you to our other panelists, Comrade 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗰 Warwick, who did yeoman service, but of course he had to leave for another important meeting. So I want to thank all of you on behalf of the 𝗟𝗲𝗏𝗪 Institute for Research and Debate, on behalf of Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, and of course all of the staff and facilitators in the background who would have made this transmission possible. I would just like to invite all the participants to make you aware that there is a link, a feedback link in the chat, which we invite you to open and to give your feedback, which will assist us as we go forward. This is, as I said, a week of debates. We are having tomorrow coming up a panel discussion on retirement and social protection. That would be from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. We also did have yesterday, of course, a webinar on the webinar yesterday was on the whole issue of labor laws in Trinidad and Tobago. So we do want to thank everyone. I think we're just on time, and just wishing all participants a pleasant day. Thank you again to all of the panelists. And at this point, we would end our webinar. So thank you to all, and do have a pleasant day. I am Trevor Johnson, Senior Fellow at the Labor College, and it was a pleasure for me to host this particular webinar. Thank you all. Good day.